moving right in, man, to this webinar about story. It is something I think that the church and us as evangelists and ministry leaders, we can think a little bit more about and maybe begin to put into practice this process and this art of good storytelling. In some of our films that we've done, this most recent one we did on a guy named Miracle Matt, we spent a lot of time strategically thinking through the gospel story in Matt, and so that's what I think we can do in ministry, and as we proclaim the gospels, do so with story and think about that element of it. And so 3 things that I really hope we can convey, and Betsy's going to run the slideshow for me, but on this next slide, there's just 3 things that I'll maybe cast out some ideas on and help you see this through the lens of story. And the first one is evangelism, the second one is discipleship, and the third one is fundraising. Now, the 3 of these, like I said, I don't presume to have all of the answers for how we're going to be better evangelists or make better disciples and raise more money and for our ministries through story. But I think, like I said, we can maybe see these elements of ministry through story a little better. Before we dive into that, I just want to give you a little bit of my story personally. I grew up in Texas, and I grew up in a really small town with about 300 people. And my dad was a pastor, and I was a middle child. There's a picture here of me and my older brother and younger sister. At the age of 5, I remember giving my life over to Christ. There's a picture of me on the right. I grew up playing traditional sports. My dad, he was nicknamed Bird Legs. He went to college in North Carolina and held the record for being the #1 champion for one-on-one at their university. So basketball was a huge thing in our family and baseball. But my dad shared the gospel with me and lived that out faithfully between my mom and his relationship and their marriage. But for me, I became saved when I was 5. My dad would always say this thing to me when we would go to school: remember who you are and whose you are. And on the next slide there, you'll see there's a picture of me. It was about this age in my life where at 6 years old, I was introduced to pornography from a friend of mine. And unlike today, you had to go out in the middle of the woods, and I found this through a friend of mine in an abandoned building. The first time I'd ever seen a pornographic image before. And nowadays, it chases you wherever you are. But it found me at the age of about 7 years old. And as I grew up in the church, as you think about story, for me, I began to have this secret story, and I kind of refer to story in 3 different ways. We have a public story, a private story, and a secret story. And on the outside, I wanted to know the Lord, and I love the Lord. It seemed like everything was going really well for me in terms of I was an outgoing kid. But on the inside, I couldn't shake this sin problem that I had. And amongst that, I've always felt like I was never really good enough. I never made A's in school. And so inwardly, I always felt like I wasn't enough, and I didn't know how to get rid of the sin that was in my life. And so the way that I viewed the church and my father was that they were perfect people. And so I was the only one that struggled with sin. I was the only one that had this problem of lust. And now fast forward all these years later, I find out my brother was in the same scenario as me then. But I do remember just thinking, man, my dad is perfect. He's never made a mistake in his life. And everyone in the church is perfect. They've never made a mistake in their life. And so my view of God was, please help me. Please take this away. And I could never confess this to the world. And I remember it taking me down to some dark roads. And about the age of 11 and 12, at this picture here is around that same time, there'd be some moments in my life, particularly at night going to bed, where I just thought, this life is never going to change. I could never tell the world what I'm struggling with, because if I did, they would make fun of me. I would be embarrassed. They wouldn't understand. They wouldn't help me. And there'd be a lot of shame and guilt that came with that. But I remember there was a guy that came to my dad's church, and he spoke on the freedom in Christ, knowing the truth, and the truth will set you free. And a joke, but my dad never invited him back to our church again, because he said butt and crap in the same message. Very evangelistical. But it cut me to the core that night, and I knew that Jesus was speaking to me. and that I could have freedom from this. Because months passed prior to that, I was actually thinking about taking my life. And that night, I just had this new view of God, that no matter what, that I would confess my sin. Even if I was the only person in the world that ever struggled with this, that I wanted freedom and that Jesus could set me free. So I ran down and I literally just vomited out my confession and sin before my dad, who was the pastor. And I remember getting free, and it brought my dad and I closer. He became an accountability partner in my life. And so fast forward, and that's kind of the moment, not necessarily when I got saved, that was a big part of my story, but the opportunity and time of my life where I saw God in the lens and his true biblical character versus how I perceived him through the church and perceived him through my father. And so I think that story, ultimately, we'll talk a little bit about that, but that's the element of story, and what story can do is it helps change the lens and the way that people view the church and Christians. So next slide there is a little bit more of my story. There's a magazine here on the left. As any good husband will say, they married way up. And it's true. I married way outside of my league. My wife's name's Emily. There's a water ski magazine there. Before I ever met Emily in Texas, I was working as a wakeboard instructor, and I saw this picture of Emily, and it said her airness on it, and which is the title they gave Michael Jordan. So it drew me in, and instantly I thought, gosh, this girl's gorgeous. And later on, I'm reading, man, who gives this girl the title of my hero? And in the article, though, it talked about how Emily was passionate about knowing Jesus. And I jokingly took that article, turned around, and showed my director at the camp, who I'm still friends with today. I said, man, I'm going to marry this girl. And it's a long story, but 2 years later, I happened to be going to Bible college at that time in Texas. And Emily's best friend from Colorado came to that school where I was at that one semester, had lunch, the same table I was having lunch. We struck up a conversation. I found out she was Emily's best friend, said, I'm going to marry your best friend. And so kind of fast forwarding, that was in 2003. Emily and I got married. She and I have been able to do ministry together for about 8 to 10 years. We did church services on the pro wakeboarding tour together with some other pro athletes and Emily. And so I'm just in love with her today as I was then. She continues to amaze me. She's retired from the sport of wakeboarding after being one of the winningest females in that sport, and just happened to sign up for the TV show called American Ninja Warrior. So still, into her 30s now, still crushing it. And I have learned to be content in the Lord, because when your wife had made more money than you doing things as a sport and was stronger than you, definitely your contentment in the Lord. But man, I'm just real blessed to be in ministry with her. She is a pillar. She pursues Jesus like no other person I know. And so we're a great combination and tag team. And I hope that's the truth in case for all of you guys who are married, that you guys see your spouses that way, and that the Lord is using your guys not only on your mission field, but in your ministry, your first ministry to your family, your wife, and your kids. I think that's the struggle every ministry leader is going to have. So the next picture, you'll just see there's a picture of my wife and I and our family, and our little man here. So during the summertime, we take off in the RV, and for the last 4 years at least, and we do some inner city ministry. And there's a picture of our son. It's a long story, I won't tell it, but we adopted him, and he's just been a real blessing. So to be able to see your children do ministry, it's a beautiful mess at times when you're in an RV and driving down the road. But so that's a little bit about our family. I hope that several of the things I hope you can gain out of this today is I hope that I can be an encouragement to you guys. I'd like you to think about your own stories today. We get caught up oftentimes in ministry thinking about the gospel and moving it forward in people's lives. And today I want you to think about your story. Several things to think about. When did you get saved? What was that moment like when you got saved? I think it's important to go back and revisit that. So keep that in your mind today, right now, and even as we're moving forward, is to have your memory jogged up, because your story matters. And I truly believe that your story is important. And, I said, I think there's 100 guys that could do this webinar perfectly fine. And have at times wondered if I'm the right person to be doing it. Lord, should I? And so right above this, I put this reminder. Many of you probably heard, God doesn't call the qualified, he qualifies the called. And friends, you are called and qualified. And so please know that. Please know that I'm encouraging myself on the same thing, that my story matters. And it matters to God first and foremost. As you guys will see on the slide will come down, there's a few little item points there. I want to share with you what your story matters. And your story matters to God. Story comparison, we can talk about that in many different facets. The story comparison is what we all can fall victim to. And that is, well, one person's ministry is advancing further than mine, and he's got a larger crowd at his webinar or his crusade. Or for me, if someone makes a film, I mean, people ask me if I know I am second, and of course I do. Everyone does. And they know that we do films, and they'll want to say that. And at times I've thought, man, and I just don't have as good of a thing. Or Brian Jennings makes incredible films. And story comparison can take us out of this thing that our story matters to God. He's uniquely gifted me where I'm at to be where I'm at, to be me. And the same thing is true with you. He's gifted you to be who you are, doing what you're doing. And you need to do that to the fullest of your capabilities. Revisiting your story will remind you that it matters to God, that you matter to the Lord. And it'll assure your calling. It also, next slide there, there you go. Two, it matters to you. I think about my story oftentimes as I revisit my own story. I'm reminded of God's goodness in my life, and it points me to the author of my story. And I think when we look at our past story of how either we were saved or he's redeeming us, those moments for me remind me of the need that I have for the Lord. When I think back about my own story, it starts to humble me and shrink me down, and it lifts up this name of God, and it helps me see what a great God he is to move heaven and earth and to save me and to give me this relationship with him. And so it matters to God, it matters to you, and it matters to the church. So I think in some capacity, all of us work alongside of churches or other ministries, and as evangelists, I think we've all pretty familiar with some of the challenges that can be there. Of course, Palau has done an incredible job with not only partnering with churches, but the cities. But I think your story is important there because story does so much with connection. And I think you'll combine story with two different things when you work with the church. Sharing your own story, where you are, where you've come from, and the work Christ has done in your life can uniquely make a resounding yes to the church. Even before the mission or the objective with the church that you're hoping to gain out of them has been talked about or spoken of. To start with story, it just creates the bond to find out what the pastor's stories are. And so I would encourage you in any church effort, first of all, to see where God's already working at, and to get to know those pastors even better, to spend time with them, to be an encouragement to them, and allow story to foster that relationship. And so it matters to God, it matters to the church, and it matters to others. It matters to your family. So I spoke a little bit about this. The next one is to your others. Your story matters to your family. And, 2010, maybe 2011, Emily and I were really struggling in ministry with fundraising. And I was working 2 different jobs at the time and really trying to do ministry full time, but almost had this sort of sense of pride that, well, I don't want to draw a salary from the ministry, therefore I'll work these 2 jobs. And what it did is it ended up really making me absent from our family. And it was a little bit longer story there, but as God redeemed me from that in a much needed situation where my wife and I basically were even at a point where we needed so much help in our marriage, it'd become because I had put the ministry before Emily. And so there's no greater reflection of God's story than our family seeing him and us as husbands and as fathers. And so I think we've probably all journeyed down that, and at times seen sort of the conflict between attention and time and what we give to ministry, what we give to our family. So I'll just encourage you guys to always consider that over the course of time, your family will look back and see this reflection of your story being lived out. And I think that if I could encourage all of us, I would say let's make sure that our family repeats, it looks back on our lives and our story and goes, man, this has been a father that and a husband that has followed Jesus and led our family, and not see someone who has left our family to follow Jesus. Quick story is I met my guy who was doing Terminex, and the Terminex guy came to my house about 3 months ago, and he was a pastor. I kind of subtly started picking up on as I was getting to know him and asking questions about his life and his career. And we looked up at the sky and we both noticed, man, what a beautiful day, man. God is good. And we started picking up these little Christian flags. And the next thing I know, this guy starts talking a little bit deeper theology than just, man, yeah, the sky is blue. No, like God formed this from the beginning of time. He made you. I'm like, so I started getting some questions going about him, found out he was a pastor for 25 years. And he told me in seminary that to go after ministry and to follow Jesus and be a leader meant you would abandon everything else at all costs to do that. And so he took that to the point of even pushing his family to the side. And he did that for 25 plus years. His wife separated from him, and his 2 daughters left the faith. And it wasn't until after he left and said, man, I'm done. I can't do this anymore. He took a job with Terminex that had been there 5 years to the day I met him. And to hear him talk about the joy that he had and what God had done to redeem him out of that, now that his girls have come back to the Lord and his marriage has been restored, was one of those moments where I just kind of paused and I thought, I see him there and I see the joy that he has in doing this other job. And so on one hand, it's good because we can look at it and go, Lord, we can be content doing anything. And if ministry ever gets in the way of our family, then allow us to take a step back and to relook at it so that we aren't pushing our families away, even at the sake of advancing the gospel. So I would say family first, and your stories reflect that. Listen to your children because they'll tell the story that you're living out, hands down. Your wife will tell you, you may not listen to that, but your children will begin to reflect it, and it'll be hard to tune that out. To this generation, your story matters. The work that you do, it matters to God, it matters to you, it matters to the church, but it matters to a generation of I'm a person, you guys, whatever it is that touches people's lives and people in their life, and they will get married to have kids and teach their kids about Jesus, and it will come from work that you do. And so I really believe that your story matters. Like I got saved when I was 5, but my salvation came years prior, 2 generations prior to getting saved. It was at a Billy Graham crusade. My grandfather, back in 1957, he left my dad and my dad's 5 siblings in North Carolina, and he was an alcoholic electrician. And my dad was about 7 years old, loved playing basketball and baseball, but he never spent time with my grandfather, his dad, because he was an alcoholic and abusive. And so my grandfather left my dad, and he went to New York. And sorry, I get a little emotional to talk about my story, but my grandfather left my family, and he came back the first year, and he would enter back into my dad's life and all the siblings. And my dad, I said, what did you do? And my grandfather would come back, and he would be so drunk and abusive. My dad said that all the siblings and him would run and leave and go to the cornfield, and they'd spend all day there and all night there and come back just to eat and go to bed until he would leave, and then they would stick around the house. And so then my grandfather left for about 7 years and moved to New York City and was an electrician there. In 1957, my grandfather was outside Madison Square Garden, and he was drunk, sleeping on a bench. And apparently he had frequently slept on this bench before all night with one of his drinking buddies. And that drinking buddy gave his life to the Lord. And down in Madison Square Garden, 1957, there's a few weeks period where Billy Graham was doing a crusade, and my grandfather's buddy who had gotten saved found my grandfather on that bench, and he woke him up and drug him into Billy Graham's crusade. And my grandfather heard the gospel, sobered up, and went back the next night and gave his life to the Lord. And so my grandfather came back to North Carolina with my dad, and was a pretty rugged man and still had a lot of kinks to work out, but he came back and slowly crept back in as a father, and ended up teaching my dad how to play sports, and taught him the love of the Lord. And long story short, my dad got saved when he was about 14, and my grandfather looked at him and said, "This is the second best day of my life. The first day was the day I gave my life to Christ. The second day was the day my prayers were answered that you would give your life to Christ." And so it's kind of the story of there he is, James Durham. He died this past year. And what I love about my grandfather is this: pretty simple man. Didn't run a ministry. Never organized a fundraising meeting. Never did a board meeting. But I went to visit him. He lived in Fort Myers, and my wife and our kids would go down there, and my family. And every Sunday he would stand outside of the church down there in Fort Myers. I forget the name of the church, but there's about maybe 1,000 people that go to this church, and he would stand outside at the end of the church, and he would hand out written testimonies to people, his story, and a story of how he gave his life to Christ, and he would hope that those people would do the same thing. And so I just saw my grandfather as a man who believed. He met Jesus, he saw Jesus, and he told other people about Jesus. And his story to him was one that's gone on to change generations. And so what you're doing is 100% sure changing generations, and God is using you to do that. And so you're rewriting the narrative for people, and you're giving people a story that then they can pass on to their kids, their grandkids. And so for me to be able to do this webinar for you guys is so humbling and such an honor, because there's 20 of you guys on here now. I know you guys have incredible stories. I know what God's done in your life is incredible. And I'm a product of what God can do through evangelists. And so you're important and you're needed. And so I hope that this story is an encouragement to you guys, that you will be encouraged in your own stories as you remember that God is doing immense things in and through you, and your story can really help shape that for you. And so the next step there, we're kind of talking about postmodernism, evangelism through story in a postmodern world, and it's just fascinating. I have thought about postmodernism and read a ton on it before, and you think therefore you are, it's kind of the modernistic view standpoint, and I would look at this and just say, well, just stop thinking. And postmodernism is hard to define, and I would say, can you describe postmodernism? And I feel like most people don't describe postmodernism because they have no idea what it actually means. And there are some people a lot smarter than me that have done a good job about it. But I think to kind of summarize, I put this picture in here. These windmills, as we drive across the country in our RV, these windmills, my kids are looking like, wow, what are those things, Daddy? And it's one of those things I look out there, I'm like, I have no idea, and it looks like the craziest things, because these fields will be covered with hundreds and thousands of these windmills. Of course, they're producing energy, but we have no idea how. And yet they're constantly all over the Midwest. And just looked at them and just like, man, I don't really know how to describe what's going on there. Obviously, wind is a part of that, but there's so much more to it that we don't get, we don't understand, we don't even know if it's actually working. And I think about postmodernism in that way. I do believe that I understand one thing about postmodernism is I don't understand it, which means people are acting and have a belief system that isn't completely understandable in terms of how we may have understood it for the last, 40 decades or, 4 decades or half a century. And part of that will play into our direct plan of action for how we evangelize, for how we share the gospel. And I think you have, one culture side of things with the Western culture, which definitely is postmodern. And then you look across the country in places like China and Africa, that they're not as postmodern. So tactics for evangelism that were in a modernistic time are still very active. And, it's in this Western culture as we look at evangelism in the church, that we have this need for re-examining our tactics. And so I kind of think that there are hills in terms of how we think evangelism and communication to the lost world should go. And then there's a reality of how people are actually receiving evangelism and receiving or perceiving the church. And are there hills that we're willing to come off of and perhaps look at our approach to evangelism and our approach to in engaging in a postmodern world? And story, I believe, is a timely part of how we engage in this. And so part of this is how does the postmodern world see the church? I think it's changed in a lot of ways. The way I see most of my interactions with people in this postmodernistic world is that they can see you coming from a mile away. And they already have a preconceived idea about everything that we believe. In fact, absolute truth doesn't exist. Therefore, the gospel truth is kind of in some ways stupid for people who are not Christians. And they look at it and say, well, clearly that's something that you believe, but I don't believe that. And so we have this wall that's there, and it's been put up because of what we call tolerance. And everyone is tolerant except for Christianity. And so it's our job to kind of say, well, in that case, are we going to be willing to jump into those conversations with a postmodern culture? And perhaps I would say that story could do that. I think that story is this thing that, truth can be subjective, as I put in there, but story is inviting. And absolute truth is not subjective, right? According to the Bible, like God's word is true, but according to people who don't believe the Bible, it's not, it's subjective. And so therefore items like sin or righteousness or, redemption, sanctification are all things in the lens of the world is something that's, perhaps even stupid or disbelieving because it's subjective to them. But story is this invitation to get to know someone, which is not happening in the church. We're struggling with how do we engage the people? And I guess across the board, we would say, like, I think churches would admit that at least we're hoping and encouraging and trying to get our church people and Christians and believers to share and talk about Jesus. But I think as it stands right now, we're struggling with that. And I think story can be a huge part of interacting with this postmodern world as we struggle to even understand what that is. So evangelism. Evangelism. Once upon a time, in the beginning, this is a fun night for me every night when I get to put my kids in the bed and I begin story with them. And I never really realized this, but I never taught my kids how to tell stories, but I always start my stories with once upon a time in a land far, far away. And then I start with the story. And more recent, in the last year, my stories have become so bizarre and elaborate and bringing all kinds of characters in. I've just been trying to see if my kids are going to stick around. And every time I stop somewhere in the middle and they're like, and I think they're sleeping or not paying attention, they jump over, like, oh, what, don't stop there. That's not a good enough story. And so there's this thing that I pick up on in storytelling, that evangelism is just, well, like I said earlier, it's not a new thing. It's something that Jesus did. And so I want us to kind of think about evangelism through the lens of story. And there's a few elements here that we'll go through in this next slide. So Mark Truby, Vice President of Communications at Ford Motor Company, he said, a good story makes you feel something and is universal. They want to grasp your values and your commitment to excellence, to be inspired and intrigued. Storytelling is the most powerful way to convey these ideas. So up on the top there, that slide, I just said, imagine how story conveys the gospel, cross-culturally creating intrigue and inspiration for hope. There's Mark Truby and the Ford Motor Company, just one example of how story is taking over and has been taking over for a good number of years now. I think Nike is one of the main companies that we could look globally and say, man, they've done an incredible job of storytelling. And the church is coming up all over the place as I think about different podcasts, and even a pastor in Northland Church in Orlando just put out a podcast on how important story is. And I love that. That's exciting to me because as Mark says here, a good story makes you feel something and is universal. They want you to grasp the values and commitment to excellence, to be inspired and intrigued. Storytelling is the most powerful way to convey these ideas. And so essentially, story and Mark's idea and the world's idea is that it's universal. And I think that's the element that universalism can play into story in terms of the gospel, is that the gospel is this global story. It transcends generation. And so because of storytelling, it lends itself to create this inspiration and intrigue. I mean, I think that's intrigue and inspiration and wonder is what gets instilled into a postmodern mind. Someone who doesn't know Christ, this story, this entering into story, both with sharing and listening, it brings, I think, leads us into. So the next slide there, I got to kind of hurry up. We're running out of time. It's not built on a system. I see story as being very messy, and it changes constantly. But what it is a bridge. And I think we have this systematic theology that, I grew up going into in a Southern Baptist background and going to Bible school. He has definitely talked about even evangelism is a theological term, but people are narrative and they live outside. And so what it is story can be this bridge for the system of theology that helps us sort of put God in this frame of understanding, which is great for discipleship and evangelism. Systematic. People are story driven. And so the challenge would be even in evangelism and proclamation of it would be, how do we see story be that bridge for the systematic theology? Meet story, the perfect timing in our culture. The third there is the knowing the mirrored effect. So story reveals the story, creation, fall, redemption. This is sort of the framework that I look at for story. And I think when we look at this, guys, I know that most of you are proclaiming the gospel, and sometimes you're doing probably different elements, whether it's a crusade or a smaller outreach. But in any case, I think these have correlation for both the proclamation of the gospel, but also it has some correlation for equipping and training leaders and volunteers who do follow-up at those events, especially in the church. And so, take what you can from this, but knowing the mirrored effect, I think, helps us to be able to believe that story reveals the story. And in that, I say that there's two common things in every human, the creation and the fall story. And so as we have this mirrored effect, my story mirrors God's and God's story mirrors mine. And so part of evangelism in a postmodern world is to help people's story look into the story of God. And to be able to connect those dots for people is a huge thing to help them break down some barriers. The two common ones are creation and fall. We have that common denominator. And so in any conversation we ever want to venture into with a person or a group of people, we can share our creation story. We can invite them to consider their creation story and then share our experiences of the fall. And at the same time, we're mirroring the story of God as well. So God's creation, his intent, the fall of Adam and Eve, and therefore how that's brought sin and death to all of us. And so even taking story and explaining things like sin and death in a story, in story form is I think huge, is helping people understand where their story actually reflects the result of the fall. And so what is death? Of course it was separation, but is it actually evident even now in someone's story? Is death happening now? And in many cases it is, because it's represented in the loss of their family, the struggle to have enough means to make it by. A loved one's passed away. All of that lends itself to an opportunity to say, man, perhaps you would want to know the gospel. Perhaps that, through my story, through God's story, this would all make sense. And then we share with them the redemption of Christ and renewal through the Holy Spirit. So how does story look different from other methods? And maybe I would say, how would you see yourself implementing these and things that you guys are already doing? Redemptive listening breeds story immersion. oftentimes we talk about sharing your story, and we want our churches to go out and do this, and it's incredible. It's huge to push them to do that, but oftentimes we're nervous to share our story for a few different reasons. But the redemptive listening is this art that I talk about often, where before we ever talk or share anything, redemptive listening is being able to hear someone's story and listen for the longings that they have for their Creator. As Scripture says, God's put eternity in our hearts, and so as I convey with people, there's certain longings that we have in our hearts and our lives, and as you hear someone's story, those things will be revealed. And then this is a connection, right, for the gospel story, your story, into others, as we immerse yourself into their story. The problem is, number 5 talks about these barriers. And there's, I think, 3 main barriers that I see sort of in front of believers as we need to equip them and train them, is that, number 1, people don't believe they have a story. And we're sort of the ones probably to blame for it, or at least partially, as churches have found good stories, and I've even done that because we did films with athletes. But we take somebody's story who's a celebrity or an athlete or someone who came from drugs and alcohol addiction, and we put them in front of our church congregations or in front of a group of people, and they share their story, and it ends up being this incredible testimony of God, and people walk away inspired. And then that's really it, though, because everyone else that's in the audience, most of them haven't come from drugs and alcohol background, or they haven't been a pro athlete or a CEO of a company. And so there's this story comparison that takes place in their own ability to believe that what God's done in their life is tremendous and remarkable and needs to be discovered. And so part of it is to say to people, you do have a story, right? The story isn't about drugs and alcohol. The story isn't about the success you have as an athlete, or the fact that you were, the best at a sport, or that you rose to the top of a career. Those stories are fewer and far between. And so in some ways, we're trying to say, let's look deeper and actually see the author of every story. And in that case, we can find the small little things in anybody's story and highlight it and show them the bigness of God and say, this is God at work in your life. You have a story that matters. You have a story that needs to be told. And so that's one of the things, is helping people see, man, you have a powerful story. The other thing that I would say is not having the right knowledge. And so helping people who we're saying go out and share the gospel and wanting to equip people. One of those elements would be to help people be free from this idea that we have to have every Bible verse memorized or have the Roman road down pat. I mean, all that, obviously is a huge part of the Christian faith, is memorizing Scripture, but to give people this sort of support that they need to have conversations with people. So to help them be free to teach and kind of tear down this barrier of winning people over by knowledge, or being afraid to actually have conversations with people because we don't have enough knowledge. Questions like, what if they don't agree with me? What if they ask me about creation and I can't prove it? What if they ask me how I know Jesus, rose from the dead? And so to be able to give people confidence to say, listen, we're not here to win people over. That's not what's going to work in a postmodern world. They're actually looking for us to try to win them over so that they can dispute everything that we have to say. So when we come at them freed from this element of trying to persuade and convince, and we're just in the story with them. We're in their story. We're not here to convince. We're actually here to get to know them. I think that's freeing, because then at that point, we're having conversations and discovering stories wherever we go with whoever we meet. At the end there, how do we see evangelism work? I think ultimately for us, we did an event about 3 years ago at a church where we filmed 60 stories in 2 days, filmed, edited, and put and distributed through their Facebook page, mostly high school students. And what I found is that for camera. In fact, this guy makes me, terrified to be on here right now. But as you get down to it, there's much harder work that's actually a better work. It just takes longer. And that is to train people on the most important things right now in Christian ministry, is actually to take people through the story process to help them discover God is that. I don't think there's any other way to do it except to train hard, to work hard at it. And so I would say I'm personally most convicted right now and led by the Lord is to do what I can in our ministry to help people discover their stories. And so the next thing is I'm kind of running out of time. Sorry, Dave. We'll keep trucking along here. We're talking about discipleship. I've got a little quote there. If you can hear me, Betsy. Discipleship through story. This is kind of speed things along here. I mean, what story does in terms of discipleship is it allows people to have a working platform for the gospel to sanctify. And the way I see most of ministry as I've grown up and been a part of a lot of small groups is that our small groups build upon theology and bring story in as a side thing. And most of story on the side note would be, what did you think about this particular passage? How does this apply to your life? And those scenarios for me, as I noticed, that usually only a couple people would talk in those moments, people who were going through some sort of formal training in Bible school, or those who were really outgoing. And so for the most part, you would lose the majority of the group for a couple of reasons. But I think part of it is there wasn't already a mutual sharing that took place. Our sharing was based upon our knowledge again. It wasn't based upon the direct correlation between our story and what was being shared or read in Scripture. And so discipleship through story, I think, is what it does. And number 3, it opens up the door and lets some light in. And this is essentially what discipleship is in repentance and redemption, because that story gets shared. One guy shares a story about his failures or some of the things he struggles with. The light comes in, as Jesus says, you come into the light, your deeds will be exposed. So this is what discipleship is. But as we stand, most of our church members, like I was growing up, man, we don't say a word about what we struggle about. We leave it sort of all inside, internalize it, because we're afraid we're the only ones dealing with it. And so when your story kind of is exposed alongside of someone else's, we see the brokenness and we see the vulnerability in that. And then Christ comes in. We celebrate his redemption in us through repentance, through healing over certain things that have been done to us or certain wounds that we've gone through. And I also see number 4, how it actually builds theology, because as people go through their story and expose where their need is for the gospel, then as a good leader and a trainer and story-driven discipleship, we get to come in and say, man, let me just help you shape this journey out that you're going through the lens of what God says in his story. And then you can bring out God's story in his word and help people see the correlation there, because they've already expressed their story. It builds immense community. I'm witnessing this firsthand right now. And then I think it puts the church on mission, because we've often said, go and evangelize. And I grew up going to house with my dad, evangelizing people. He was very good, but predominantly what would happen is we would get people to a point of knowing their story. And then we just get to this abrupt moment where we would say, hey man, so yeah, good to know you. By the way, I'm just want you to know God loves you, and do you know where you go tomorrow if you die? Would you spend eternity in heaven? And I think in a modern world, when I was growing up, I saw that work. I saw people come to know the Lord with my dad. I think we see it in these crusades and evangelistical meetings as well. And God will constantly and continue to use so many facets of the proclamation of the gospel. But I would see it in terms of story. If we want to see our church go out and do evangelism, we have to equip them with this story. And it comes in this discipleship process so that they can actually see how God's story is infused in theirs, and how their story brings to light God. And then as they go out into the world, they're equipped with this powerful tool to not only engage the world with a fuller, deeper story. In fact, there's a guy named Kruger. I think his name's Jim Kruger. He's an author for Marvel Comics, and recently I heard him do a talk on this. But he talked about how Marvel Comics is very interested in the long story, and the short story is what people are not as engaged in, but the long story is. And so you have Superman, and you have all these other prequels and sequels that come after, because people want to know what happened to Superman, how did he get here, and the same is true with all the other Marvel comics. So it's interesting to see that that's where Marvel Comics is going, as they see people want to know deeper into the story. And I think that's where we have an opportunity. We have the longest story in human history. It's the story of God. He's the creator. And so it's a beautiful story to share with our church and our congregations and through our ministries, to say, to people that we're training, hey, we're helping people see this tremendously beautiful story of God, and how their story, when they get equipped with it, is a massive part of that plan to be on mission. To see people go out into the community and say, man, I'm ready. I'm ready to talk to anybody about their story. Every single person I see, I often think to myself, no matter where I go, I wonder what their story is. And I always assume two things. One, God's already been there. I'm not the first. So I'm not here to convince them that God's real. They already made the decision about him, and I'll find out why. My goal is to say, man, what was it? You know, and when you find out what it was that turned them either towards God or away from God. And that's when you find out where they were on their perception at that time in their life, or those multiple times in their life, sorry guys, where someone denied or decided to not believe in God. And like me, that's an opportunity for us as good storytellers to say, well, perhaps what if that perception that you have of God is not the right perception? It was the wrong one. And case in point was, Dave, right after I met with you that day, I went around the corner at the convention hall there, and there was a guy there, a black guy there, building the Bible Museum. And I just happened to poke my head in that big room, and I said, man, what is this? He goes, oh, it's the Bible Museum. And so I thought, wow, do you work for the Bible Museum? He goes, no, I don't. I said, well, that's interesting. Are you a Christian? He said, no, I'm not. And so I just paused for a second. We looked at each other. I was like, man, that is pretty ironic, kind of, to not be a Christian and not believe in this, but actually be building a museum that is talking about this very thing that you don't believe in. And he looked back at me. He goes, yeah, man, you're telling me I've thought about that several times today. And so, Dave, that day, man, I just stopped my tracks. I had some time, and I knelt down with him, and I got down on his level, and I helped him build this little set there for about an hour. And I just remember, I said, I found out his story. I was like, so man, where are you from? And through a series of questions, just eventually said, so what was it about God that kind of turned you away? Or what was it in your story? And he goes, man, I used to go to church. When I was a little kid, my grandmother took me to church. And he said, I never wanted to stop going because I knew it would make her so sad. But what had happened was he had a friend of his die. And that ultimately is what pushed him away from God. And so I helped him understand a little bit through story. I just said, man, what if that moment of your friend dying created in you a wrong view, possibly, of God? But what if the view that your grandmother had was the true view? That whatever she was going after when you were a kid that you didn't want to disappoint her in, that she wanted you to go and experience, that God was real and that he was true. But then when your friend died, you looked at God and blamed him and said, well, if you are true, then you wouldn't have let this happen if you are real. But perhaps God didn't let it happen. What if there was another part of the story there that if found out why, you would see that God was actually good and that God actually cares about the fact that your friend dies, and he empathizes with the fact that your friend dies because he's experienced death. His son died, and his son didn't just die in a car accident. His son died for you and for me. And so that story kind of went on there, but just to give you this idea of what how story kind of interacts and how I see it interacting with people. In that moment, for me, it was just drawing this correlation, and instead of coming at somebody with a question that may be abruptly about their decision over eternity, maybe finding out where they were prior to the decision and what led them to that. It's a lot of fun, man. I think that if we can train our church members and our ministry leaders in that way, we can have a lot of fun sharing the gospel. And so the next slide, I think, is on fundraising, and I'll try to breeze through this one real quick. Celebrate, share, listen, and ask, fundraising. See, there's a quote there below, Betsy. Yeah, Sujan Patel, he's a business guy, guru, dude that's made millions now, starting his own companies and writes a blog about different things. But he wrote something on stories, that telling your story is critical to building your part or to building your brand. Look at this and say, in what ways can we weave story into ministry, fundraising, and communication? The next slide there, I think I've got, maybe it's actually, yeah, I changed it. So I changed Sujan's quote there, and telling your story is a critical part of leading your ministry. And I really do believe this. Like, there are brands that are obviously catching on to this, and I think the church is just catching on. So let's go through just a few things really quick that I think at least be some elements of story and fundraising that we can consider here on the next slide. The dangers, story comparison is across the board, whether we're evangelizing or we're discipling. But in fundraising, it's this opportunity we have to share a story. And the same is true in fundraising as it is in evangelism. People can see us coming a mile away. For me, I used to sometimes struggle with fundraising because I would talk to people about films that we were making of pro athletes, and I didn't have a malnourished child sitting in a puddle of water, in the dirt to put on my advertising for what we were doing as a ministry. And at times it would make me think, man, is doing a story of a pro athlete important? Is this important? And that's when story comparison sort of comes in, and we begin really searching hard for different stories that are not authentic, or we begin to misuse someone's story. And so I would just say, encourage you to look for story in your fundraising, but keep it true, keep it authentic, because as evangelism, the postmodern world, and people can see us coming a mile away, I think that that's true. Ultimately, God wants to be honored by our storytelling. And if we're looking for stories that are not true or they're exaggerated, our confidence is not in Him. So I would encourage you, the stories are there in your ministry. And if someone's been saved recently in your ministry, call them up and find out their story. Find out if Billy Graham would have called me, that he could have probably raised millions of dollars this past year if you found out my grandfather died and got saved in 1957. So find out what those stories are, and use them. Like, honor those people, celebrate those people's lives that your ministry has touched, so that the people that come into your ministry to possibly support you, they'll be moved by that. They'll see the fact that you honored somebody that their support had something to do with. And I think that it'll open up their pocketbooks more. Their heart will be tuned in more to what you're doing, because they see that you honor somebody's life and their story, and it's authentic. And the practical way here, I'm just about to start doing this in 2018, but creating multiple story paths. Sorry, guys. If you're not writing a blog already, do that. I'm not. We're doing a newsletter. I'm praying about doing a podcast, and working on writing curriculum right now on how to discover your story. But I think these are all elements that do take time, but look into them and discover. Maybe you're not doing one of these elements, and you could, and it wouldn't take too much, And I think we can, for me too, like, we sort of over strategize things, and things can be more simply done, and keep story at the center of it. If a story is authentic and it's true and it's transparent, I think that it's success. I think people will be drawn to it, and do it frequently, and do it consistently. How can you immerse supporters into your story personally and in ministry? And these elements of blogs and newsletters and podcasts, I think that they will be ways that you can immerse your supporters in their stories. Knowing is believing. Number 5, know your stories, your supporters' stories well, and they'll keep giving. Get to know prospective people through story, and they'll want to give. And I do think that's true. I remember recently going to one of our supporters' houses in Orlando, and I went over there to talk to him about this year's sort of goals and budget and plan. And he had literally called and said, "Hey, on your way, could you bring your drone with you? Because I'd like to put up or take this drone up in the air and video an eagle, take some pictures of it." So I brought it over there. It was an hour and a half. I ended up having 10 minutes to talk to him about our ministry's goals and our plans and our hopes, and say, "Hey, what would you do? Would you join in?" But what happened was, him and I connected, man. We flew this drone up there and got one of the most beautiful shots of a bald eagle I'd ever seen in my life, with its 2 babies in the nest. And him and I talked about this sort of ongoing now, but now it's led us into more conversations with him. And actually, some of the things that have been drawn out in his life recently, specifically, are that he's not being fed. Some of the things he's looking for in his personal life, in terms of church and growth, is that he feels like all of the Bible studies that he's in are way over his head. And he lives in the same neck of the woods as Annika Sorensen and Tiger Woods. And so another story would be, I met with a supporter who wasn't yet a supporter, and his kids' bicycles literally got stolen off of his front porch in a pretty affluent neighborhood that morning. and the police were there. As I was trying to meet with him down the street at a Panera Bread, he calls and says, "Hey, would you come and meet with me? The police are at my house. Just come hang out with me for a little bit, and we'll talk as we go." So I jump on the hoverboard with him, and we go around his neighborhood looking for these kids with the police. Long story short, we end up sharing the gospel with these two kids who actually stole his bikes, myself and our supporter there and our friends. So, being able to allow your story, if you have time, to immerse yourself and just say, Lord, wherever you're at, whatever you're going to do, is going to be a good story, and it's going to be about you, and I'm going to bring people along with me. Trust in the story behind the stories. Guys, it's so true. I think we all need to be reminded of this. Do your fundraising from that angle, that the story of God will go forth. People will get involved. People will support you, and to believe in that, and to remember what Jesus has done for you and how he's Jehovah Jireh for your ministry and for you and your family. And trust me, this comes in a season for Emily and I right now. As 2 nights ago, we sat almost in tears just praying, Lord, we're here again and we trust you. And to pray to the Lord and to find peace is, it's a part of the testimony of our Savior that we love and we believe and trust in. So I'm there with you, trusting for God to provide still. And so the next slide there is a good one. We live in Disney World. People come all over the world looking for the happiest place on earth. Walt Disney said this: "We restore order with imagination. We instill hope again and again and again." That's what we storytellers do. This is arguably one of the best storytellers ever walked on earth besides Jesus. But it's interesting that Walt Disney said this about his storytelling and his films and movies. We restore order with imagination. We instill hope again and again and again. And that's what we storytellers do. The next slide, I just changed it, but it says essentially the same thing. We restore order with imagination. We instill hope again and again and again. That's what we evangelists do. Obviously, Walt Disney didn't say that part, but that's where I would change it. And I would say, guys, you are restoring order. The greatest story ever heard and known to man is the story of how God lost order in the fall of man, and he has sent Jesus to restore order. And he uses evangelists to restore order with imagination. And we get the privilege through story, through proclamating the gospel, to instill hope again and again and again. And the truth is, people from all over the world come to Disney. And if you want a glimpse of hell, you stand at Disney at closing time, and you will see wailing and gnashing of teeth. And so here's this idea: families sacrifice everything to come to Orlando for the greatest place on earth, only to find that it's not. And so although Walt is definitely restoring hope and imagination, he's not restoring order, because Disney cannot uphold to its promise of the happiest place on earth. The kids will testify to that, but Jesus can. And so I love that we are good storytellers. We are evangelists, and we are restoring order and through imagination and hope over and over again. So that's I think that's the last slide here.
All right. Hey, Kevin, thank you. We do have some questions. And so before we conclude this webinar, we've got our guests have a few questions for you. Let me go with this first one here. You challenged us to avoid story comparison, but let's face it, we do celebrate and push to the front people with dramatic conversion stories, causing most believers to think their story is boring because they didn't do drugs, they didn't rob some little old lady, they didn't commit a horrific felony. So how do we encourage the average Christian who thinks their story is boring?
Well, first of all, I would say if you robbed an old lady, that story should be shared, because there's nothing really manly about robbing an old lady. But I see where you're going with that. The last note on our evangelist one was to train hard. And I do believe that we're really up against that very thing, is training people, because we've been so trained over the course of time that a good story comes from your past experience or your rise to success. But here's what I would do. As soon as I find somebody that says they don't have a story, I'm like, oh, and some of our friends and our ministry people that travel with us, like, oh, great, you said the wrong thing to the wrong guy. Because within about a few minutes, if someone knows Jesus, you can find out within 5 minutes how God put the pieces and the puzzles in that person's life to bring them to Jesus. And whenever they just, you help them see this moment in time where God moved heaven and earth, and their hearts were pricked, whatever story was there, you highlight that, you celebrate that moment, and you say, listen, the story isn't about you. In the beginning, God. And in the end, God. So the Alpha and the Omega is what the story is about. And our churches, unfortunately, because we put the glamorous people up there and the ones with the radical salvation and transformation, that's kind of what we've done to our church members and our leadership and our ministries is we've look at me. I mean, to be honest with you, like it's taken me years to like want to share my story because I've often even felt myself like I married a pro athlete, but I'm not, even doing this webinar has been hard because it's story comparison and that, it definitely runs rampant, and I think that as much as we can highlight the story of God and help people, and I think it takes time. It takes this process of sharing and engaging, to slow down, to not just proclamize and share that story is important and that story is a good way, but to actually take our wheels and slow them down and put people into the process where their stories can be exchanged and shared, so that they can see the value in them. I think that's where the rubber meets the road right there, and good things will come out of that. I promise you, we're doing it. I started a story group about a month ago, and it's absolutely incredible. Our first of hopefully many story groups to come. We're seeing it, man. We're seeing people say like, I didn't really have a story, but after this story group, they're all smiles. They're just so elated that what God's done in their life.
That's great. Kevin, I got 2 or 3 questions here, kind of a similar theme. Let's see here if I can find one. Okay. People don't recognize the image of God in them. They have difficulty seeing how their story is a collision with God's story. So how do we help people see how their story does in fact connect to God's story for them?
Yeah. Can I just give you a story to help share that?
Please.
Okay. I had a meeting with a guy from Full Sail University, which is a film school out here in Orlando. But before my meeting, I was in the car and I looked across the parking lot and I saw a younger black guy there sweeping the parking lot, and it was pretty clean. And I thought to myself, I think there was just something that came out about one of the police shootings, and race is a huge part right now, as well as the LGBTQ movement and terms of like how the Christians respond and what we do as evangelists, not just as proclamators, but everyday evangelists. And so with good story intention, I got out of my car and I thought, you know what, I got to do something. I see a representative not only of class separation, but also of race. And so I walked over and I said, hey man, I just want to tell you that this parking lot looks amazing. And I don't know if your boss appreciates what you're doing out here, but I do. It means a lot, and I just wanted to say thank you. And I gave him a big hug, and he started smiling a little bit. And so I was like, the other thing is, I just recently heard a podcast that day on race and how it was segregating us even more now than ever. And I said, there's a lot of that going on. And I just said, as a guy who's white, a guy who's black, I said I wanted to bridge this gap right now and tell you, man, I love you. I don't know who you are. My name is Kevin. And he stuck his hand out there and introduced himself. And after that conversation, I found out why he moved to Orlando. And I just started asking, where are you from and what brought you to Orlando? And part of the story of Orlando people is usually we're transient. We weren't born here. There's a majority of people who moved here. And so I found out that he moved here because he felt like he never would amount to anything where he's from in Michigan. And so he decided to leave his family, come here and pursue music. And in fact, he got 3 jobs and hasn't done a single thing with music and only has 2 friends in all of Orlando, and he's been there for 2 years. And so at that point, I was like, man, what's the greatest thing you need in your life, like right now? And I was thinking he might say something about music, and he just looked at me and he goes, man, to be honest with you, I could just use a friend. And so that right there is this image, right, where story sort of brings us to a place where as good storytellers, we can infuse the love and the image of God in them and instill this value in them that God ultimately has created. And so I just began to lavish on him and listen, dude, you're an incredible guy. And do what you're doing here right now. Trust me, no one else may see it, but I'm going to tell you who does. It is the one who's created you. And when it's all said and done, everything will pass away, but those who know him. And so, man, the one that matters the most cares about you the most. And that one sort of assertion of the gospel story through my own insertion was, it came after sort of this knowing and listening to those longings that he had, where I would never have. And the story's true in Jesus with the woman at the well. He told the woman at the well, you have 5 husbands. And she goes, well, yeah, you caught me off guard. Well, if we do that, we're going to offend a lot of people. Jesus actually knew something that was a miracle, though. But because of that, she was changed. She went back and told people that she met Jesus. It takes us longer. It's the long story that we have to realize takes time. And would we be willing to commit to the long story before we just lash out at people with what we believe to be true? We can help people through discovering their longing in their heart, their redemptive longing. We can actually help them see that correlation. And that's where I think the training is important, because in general, we're not only working through a lot of barriers, but we're helping to introduce kind of a new artistic and messy concept through story. But I think it's well worth it.
Good. Here's one, Kevin. The question is this. Most Christians, when they tell their story, have great difficulty bringing the gospel into their personal story in a compelling way that the listener will want to know more. As evangelists who do evangelism training, how can we help believers be more intentional about sharing their story evangelistically?
Number 6 on that one slide, man, it's train hard, do it hard, work hard at it. I think it takes longer than one session, and it's definitely a lot of exchanging, and it takes leadership. But story, helping people see the gospel in their story and be able to share that, it only comes through the journey and the discovery of their own story. And so, case in point, the redemptive listening aspect is purely for evangelism. Before we ever open our mouth, the best thing to do with a statement is to start with a question. And people used to say, I heard a guy at Panera the other day talking to pastors saying, man, well, what's a really good conversation starter? and I walked over. I had no idea who these 2 pastors were. I was like, guys, I couldn't help overhearing what you're saying. It's great to hear you guys talk about evangelism. Found out who I was, and I said, there was a topic you guys were discussing on what's a good question for a conversation starter to get people to have talks about people with Jesus. And I said, this might be way off here, but I would say any question is a good question to start with, because right now, that's all I would love to see believers start to do is just ask anybody one question. It doesn't matter what it is, just be willing to start there. And so that's kind of the scope of where I think we have to go in evangelistical training, is to start with this whole new concept of we have to get people actually engaged in others. But even before that, helping them see their story, gosh, that's a process. And I think it's different for each believer, because God uniquely saves us. But for me, my creation story was out. My dad was a pastor, so I didn't view God in any sort of negative light, because I saw love from my family. But where I saw the gospel and my need for Christ, where my view of God had been tainted, and my story helps highlight that, is that I viewed God as this one who wasn't really accepting, and I viewed the churches that way. And so the world has a view and an assumption or a decision they've made about God and the church as well. So our stories, when we discover when Christ changed our lens, or has continued to change our lens about him, has redeemed our lives and our story, and he's also done that in terms of the church. If we have a very good gospel-centered story around those 2 things, then we actually know how to help people, how to help convey that better to the world. And again, I think it changes from each scenario, each person that we come in contact with. If we're willing to ask one question, then we get into this frontier of story that is a lot of fun, if we can train people on on how to be good storytellers and not jump in and butcher up stuff, you know.
I think, Kevin, we got time maybe just for a couple more questions. Since fundraising is the number one critical concern of NGA members, I think we'd be remiss not to have a question about fundraising from your presentation.
Yeah.
Here's the question. Groups raising money for abused women, hungry children, or orphans make good use of storytelling. Feeding a hungry child tugs at people's hearts, yet raising money for evangelism is incredibly difficult. A lot of Christians find it more compelling to meet a human need rather than an eternal spiritual need. How have you seen storytelling used effectively to raise money for evangelism?
I would say this, there's maybe two things. One, humility. If storytelling is difficult or raising funds is difficult for evangelists, then finding that very thing to leverage in story would be a good start. And I think that sort of that's what story does, is it kind of can level this playing field. It can bring people into our world. And so finding your humility in the way that you approach it might just be kind of this one, at least heart issue to deal with, is instead of maybe always looking at this grand number of amount of people that came in, which I think is phenomenal. What I loved about Kevin's thing today as he talked about Portland's transition is there were specific stories, and he never once mentioned, or maybe he did once, on how many people came to the festival. He did talk about how many people came to know Christ. It was 3,000, I think, at Portland. But he spent 40 minutes talking about all of the other small things that took place around the festival, with all the months leading up to it, and the schools that were impacted. And so I think evangelists, that one of the great things that we can do is it'll maybe take some time, but to work and find, like I said earlier, those small stories of someone, and to give attention to those, because the truth is we are even ingrained, even as leaders of evangelistical ministries, in numbers and success being determined by the growth or the outcome. And Jesus is always concerned about the small one, the one that gave his life or her life to Christ that we still didn't meet yet. And he would be the one that would venture right on over past the fundraising booth and over to the side corner and said, I know you wondered how you got here, but I love you, and I brought you here to this event. You know, this is kind of this different lens of Jesus and his story. So I would say find out what those are. And can I just say, I think it's even more conversations that can be had about this with your teams, to say, how really could we flip everything on its head with story and maybe get better fundraising going. One small idea I have practically, right, is if ultimately as an evangelist you are telling the greatest story ever known to man, that yes, we need to feed the hungry, that yes, God says look after the orphans and widows in distress, but at the end of the day, God ultimately put Jesus on the cross so that you and I could have eternal life, and so that he said go out into the world and make disciples, proclaiming the good news. This is a calling that is part of the church, so it's a storyteller's job. You know, that's the evangelist. Well, all of the planning that takes place in a fundraiser is very similar to all of the planning that takes place in an event that we do, an evangelistical event. It's behind the scenes that we find these stories of significance where God is at work. And I think those are the stories that we can begin to highlight, we can begin to share. But I would say bring story into your next fundraiser and see what happens. And so ultimately you're highlighting a time when you were saved. And if you did that at a fundraiser event, you put people in, you know, one person at each table, if you had a banquet, and you said to them, hey, you're going to just be in charge of facilitating the stories. And you had people begin to answer one or two questions about story regarding maybe their salvation, to share what it was about Christ that drew them in, or if they remember a specific time or place they got saved. You're going to find out, man, people are just going to start talking about this exciting time of their life, and you're going to see there's going to be a lot of synergy taking place. I mean, ultimately, in that one moment, everyone in your fundraiser would be talking about Jesus saving them, and that's a pretty cool thing. And so to go back and say, man, all of you talked about something. All of you brought in story into this night and you celebrated how you came to know Christ, whatever that was you shared. And so for you guys, I think you could capitalize on this, that there are people that will be fed. There are people that will get housing that didn't have it before. And there will be widows that will be cared for. But our ministry, your ministry, is one that wants to bring living water to people so that they will thirst no more. And so that one day, if someone ever asks them what their story is, just like you guys did, they could stand before anyone or in a group and a table of people and say, well, I got saved, and I got saved through this crusade or through this ministry called whatever yours is. And I think you're telling people, listen, the story that you shared exists and it's powerful and it's meaningful. And we as a ministry exist because we believe that that story is just as powerful and needs to be shared with the rest of the world. And here's where we're called to do it. I think that's the element where I think you see story kind of enter into fundraising and would be enjoyable and, again, perhaps messy, but be prepared for that.
All right, last question, Kevin. This question is, do you have any advice on how to make stories more engaging, such as improving delivery or giving more vivid details? What advice do you have on how to make our stories more engaging?
Well, I think that that's a good question. It would depend on the medium in which you were giving your story. If it was a film, it would be dependent on the style of the film. If you were making a little feature film or you're doing a sit-down documentary interview, or if you were kind of doing a spoken word. So I think the median will change that. I think in any situation, we ought to be helping people discover how to share their stories with great enthusiasm, and with a sense of awe, but possibly a little bit of wonder in there. I often tell people who are going to share their story, hey, lead with a question, maybe bring 2 or 3 more questions in there. And one example might be, have you ever had this view of God that you just thought for sure was true? And then something in your life happens, or someone comes in your life and you're like, wow, maybe it's not. And then follow that up with, this is the case with me. And for my example would be my story maybe when I was 12, of my view of the church, and how a preacher came and reshaped that view. And I felt like my heart was opened up for the first time in my life that other people also are broken. I'm not the only one. And so questions, lend itself that way in story. But we're going to start doing something this year. It's really small, but I think I'm excited about it. We're celebrating story in a way we're going to give it away to people. We're going to do a story night where we bring people out through the story groups we're doing. And after they're trained, we're going to do one event right now where those storytellers will come and present their stories. And so I've been working with several story presenters for that night. I'm trying to tell their story in this unique way. Maybe it's question driven. We've got one guy who's going to do music where he's going to sing a few different lines from songs that represents portions of his story that in the end, point to the gospel. But in that night, I'm really hoping that we'll be able to partner with some organizations in Orlando that do good work in our city, looking after orphans and widows and the poor and the impoverished people in our city who are doing good things, and actually help tell their stories at this event. I mean, this won't be a huge event, but maybe 100 people or more, but bring these people in, because the same thing is true in our organization. I've found out is believers just don't know what's going on in our city. They don't know the other good organizations and ministries that are doing excellent work. And so we want to be able to, as a ministry, share those stories with people and kind of bring story into this. But to answer that question, we're kind of moving in that direction of, hey, figure out a way to dramatize this out for this particular event. But if it's sharing just in general, there's, again, the hardest work I would say would be putting people through, something like what I'm calling story groups, where we explicitly say, here's the curriculum, here's the training. In 8 weeks, you'll have shared your story, you'll have heard everyone else's in the groups, and you'll have gone through these sort of key elements and principles of good storytelling. Go be a good story practitioner. That's kind of our where we're moving right now next year.
Kevin, thank you.
Good question, man.
Yeah, thanks, brother. Hey, if we didn't get to your question today, you can email your questions to Kevin. It's Kevin at thisismystory.org. Oh, I wish we could go longer, but we're out of time. But hey, Kevin, on behalf of the entire NGA family, man, brother, just a big, big thank you. Great webinar. Thank you for your time. Hey, for those of you who joined us today, just a reminder that we do 5 or 6 of these webinars annually. And if you've got a topic you'd like covered by NGA and one of our members, please email the NGA staff, let us know, and we'll try to cover your topics in an upcoming webinar. Also, do visit the NGA website for a listing of upcoming NGA events. The website does list webinars, resources, opportunities to collaborate with other members, and just a lot of good information on all of our NGA members, including Kevin's ministry. And again, the website is nextgenerationalliance.org. Kevin, again, thank you, and continue to do the work of an evangelist. Persist, everybody. God bless all of you. Thanks.